You can. Yeah. People probably won't have them, but you can do that.
Are you going to take some pictures? Can you send me a couple so I can? Okay, thank you. I always forget that I use my phone to live stream them, so then I'm like.
I usually bring a second, but I woke up late, was walking, talking, and drinking coffee and hair and makeup all at the same time, and so it's still on my desk.
Yep, I've done that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Bailey Martin Rutliff, and I am the Executive Director here at the Kansas Oil Museum. I am loving these speaker series that my assistant has actually put together. She has done a fabulous job bringing in some phenomenal speakers and really showcasing the history of El Dorado and of Butler County. So she's not here, but she is watching the live stream, so if we could just give her a round of applause for doing a wonderful job. Just so everyone knows what's going on here at the museum, we have our speaker series the third Thursday of every month. You can pre-order lunch. We order those through Bruco. You can pre-order them the Wednesday, so the third Wednesday before our series, and it will be here ready for you Thursday during lunchtime. Tonight we have our Voices of Butler County. It is a poetry, short story, art, music, anything artistic that you can think of event from people either from Butler County or who has connections to Butler County and showcasing their work. That is what these paintings are. They're set up for our Voices of Butler County event tonight. We have a couple of poets, a couple authors, an artist. So come back this evening and listen to that. Autumn will also be here this evening reading some excerpts from her book. So now I'm going to introduce Autumn Hearne to y'all.
Hello. Are my microphones on? Am I good?
Can you talk?
Hello, hello.
Test, test. It's not picking up your voice.
Test, test. Hello, hello.
Let me try turning it
Okay.
off. Okay, now try.
Hello, hello. I can hold it closer, I guess.
I can give you this microphone.
Okay.
You just want to hold it?
Sure. Okay, we'll try this. Hello. Hi. Everybody hear me? Hello. First, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about me. Obviously, my name is Autumn Hearne. I am from Wichita. I volunteer with the Friends of the Wichita Pioneers at Highland Cemetery, which is Wichita's oldest. We help preserve that cemetery under the direction of the cemetery historian. My husband and I, yes, my husband and I love driving around the country, looking for cool old bridges, old buildings, historic sites, and of course cemeteries. I don't consider myself a historian. I don't have any special credentials in this area, and I'm not going to pretend like I do. I'm just a lady who likes cemeteries. I consider myself an amateur at historical research, genealogy, and writing. My day job is in the consulting space, and my certifications are in tech software. So, how did I get to be here today as an author of a book on El Dorado cemeteries? Well, weirdly enough for me, the journey started with geocaching around 7 years ago. That's me finding my first geocache at Harmony Cemetery in Butler County by accident. If you're not familiar with geocaching, it's like a scavenger hunt using GPS coordinates. Someone usually hides a container in a safe place, and people use their phones or their GPS devices to find it. And we discovered that cemeteries are common locations for geocaches with the expectation that people are quiet and respectful and don't touch graves or monuments. And usually the geocaches are in tree lines or along fences, and that's where I found this one. Exploring the cemetery is kind of the bonus adventure of geocaching. And geocaching really got me exploring cemeteries and wanting to know more about the cemeteries. I wanted to know who owned the land when it became a cemetery, and who was the first person to be buried there, and how did they die, and why didn't this particular cemetery disappear like some other cemeteries have. So I dove pretty heavily into researching, and I started uncovering some really fascinating stories. And I thought maybe other people wanted to hear these stories too. So I decided to put myself out there, and I created an Instagram page to share photos and stories, and that expanded to Facebook and TikTok, and then a website. And somewhere along the way, my photos on Instagram caught the attention of a publisher that specializes in history books. And they were developing a series on cemeteries in America. And they asked me if I would be interested in submitting a book proposal. And I was really honored. And even though I had no business authoring a book on cemeteries, I said yes. So my first book was Buried Wichita, which was released in 2024, which is a photographic tour of Wichita's oldest cemeteries. After that, I had the opportunity to write another book for the series. And because my husband and I were already spending a bunch of time exploring Butler County, the answer was kind of obvious. And that turned into Buried El Dorado, which is a photographic tour of El Dorado's oldest cemeteries. It came out earlier this year, and I have copies with me if you're interested. Point of all that being, if I can do this, anybody can do it. So if you have an interest in cemeteries, and you want to put yourself out there, do it, because cool things can happen. So, okay, enough about me. So let's talk about what El Dorado cemeteries have revealed to me with a little effort and research. Visiting a cemetery can show us how communities started. If you have been to Sunset Lawn Cemetery lately, you may have seen the sign that says the Cherokee Trail crossed here. And I learned that the Cherokee Trail was, yes, sorry. I learned that the Cherokee Trail was first traveled in 1849 by pioneers and Cherokees heading to California in search of gold. After that, the trail was used by more gold seekers, the military, immigrants, and cattle drovers. Thousands of wagons passed through what would become El Dorado. And that's why El Dorado is here today. It began as a campground along the route to California. The Connor Cabin here at the museum is often called El Dorado's oldest home, and it was a trading post along the Cherokee Trail. And I learned that there are sets of trail ruts, Cherokee trail ruts, just east of Sunset Lawn Cemetery, along with a stone building that, like the Connor Cabin, also dates to the 1850s. And so this building was a way station. It was a place where travelers could rest and get food and water, swap out tired animals, make repairs, and then continue on their way. And I learned that this building and the property was actually in the Aikman family until 2015. and it had been in the Aikman family for 110 years. It was passed down through the women in Granville Aikman's family for 4 generations, which I thought was a cool piece of history, but it also sounded typical of Granville from what I learned about him. He was a judge and apparently a women's rights advocate. In 1912, we claim that he appointed the first female bailiff in America, but I've learned other judges have also claimed that. And later, he was said to have impaneled the first all-woman jury in Kansas. And even though their family has this land that's close to Sunset Lawns, his family's actually buried at Belle Vista Cemetery. So learning about the trail, the Connor cabin, and this way station suggested, to me at least, that Sunset Lawns may have been a burial place long before 1867, which is the oldest death date on a marked grave there. The cemeteries in El Dorado can show us how an area expanded and changed over time. This is a rough timeline I made of the El Dorado cemeteries that I'm aware of, or at least the ones that we can locate today. Some of these weren't originally in the city limits of El Dorado, and I know some people might not consider all of these to be El Dorado cemeteries. But because they do have El Dorado addresses today, I included them in the book, and I consider them to be El Dorado cemeteries. I think this shows that the El Dorado area was already growing and developing long before the discovery of oil here. And here's a map that shows where those cemeteries are or were located. It also struck me when researching El Dorado cemeteries that a lot of them were established to serve smaller communities that really don't exist anymore. The majority of these cemeteries are what I would call historic cemeteries with mostly older burials, and some of them have no recent burials at all. I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite El Dorado cemeteries that are in the book, and they just happen to be some of those little rural ones that are on the outskirts of town. Starting with Chelsea Cemetery, it was the first public cemetery established in El Dorado, and that makes it El Dorado's oldest. It was originally established for an extinct town called Chelsea, which was founded in 1857. Researching this cemetery, I learned that it started as a 100-foot by 85-foot square, and it grew to 3.5 acres to meet the needs of this community that is no longer here. As most of you know, Chelsea went underwater in the 70s when the dam and the reservoir were constructed. But I found that a lot of these communities like to put their cemeteries up on a hill, and Chelsea just happened to do that. And it was on just high enough ground that it was able to be saved, unlike some others in the area that had to be relocated. And there's a dike. You can kind of see this hump along the edge of the cemetery that was put there to contain the water. And I learned that that goes right over some lots that were part of Potter's Field, but apparently they say no one was buried there. So. And there's also a big low space in the middle of the cemetery, and I learned that the Corps of Engineers owns this space. It's about 1 acre. It's used for drainage, so they'll never bury anyone there. And I will mention this book a couple of times, but most of what I learned about Chelsea came from John Milbourne's book on Chelsea. It is a valuable resource on Chelsea, on the cemeteries, and on El Dorado cemeteries in general. Another one of my favorites is Pontiac Cemetery. This is in Prospect Township, and it was for a settlement called Pontiac, which was established in 1873 and is no longer here. If you're not familiar with this cemetery, it's just east of El Dorado, and it's off of Ellis Road, I think, where Pontiac, near where Pontiac was. From what I understand, Pontiac never really grew, and it only had the basics, including this tiny cemetery. And the cemetery had its first burial before the community even had a name or was established. It was established on land homesteaded by Charles and Juliana Eckel. The Eccles were founders of Pontiac, and they were described as having a good farm and a nice home. Their home was an 18 by 23 stone structure with a basement, and they had a farm with pigs and cows and fruit trees, like a lot of people. This article here says that they built something that was once only a dream to settlers on the prairie. Charles was Pontiac's first postmaster, and he ran the post office from their home. Unfortunately, Charles and Juliana buried 4 of their young children on the family farm, and that's why this cemetery is here today. And they all share this single gravestone. 2 of their daughters, Sarah and Emma, both died in November of 1871, a week apart, probably due to an illness. And then a few months later, their son William was buried here. And then a few years later, they buried another daughter named after Mom, Juliana. So these 4 children were the first known burials at Eccles Cemetery, and are why this land is a cemetery today. And then next is Economy Cemetery. So Economy Cemetery is also in Prospect Township, and it was established in 1893 on land owned by a man named Miller Fetro, one of the pioneers of a community called Economy. I've never actually found a map with Economy's name on it, but they did have the schoolhouse that was documented on a map. And the cemetery, of course, is still here today. Miller Fetro and his wife, Christiana, came to Butler County in 1871, and this is their homestead on the map with the schoolhouse there. According to Christiana's obituary, the couple experienced a pioneer life full of anxiety and hard work on the farm, but together they created a beautiful and comfortable home out of the wild prairie. Miller helped build Economy Schoolhouse, which also serves as the church, and the cemetery was put right next to it on his homestead. I learned that a lot of Fetros came to Butler County, and at least 21 of them are buried at the cemetery. And a lot of times when you have a strong family connection like that, you might at least find that the cemetery was casually called by the family's name, maybe at least an obituary or 2 referencing it that way. But I never found that this cemetery was called Fetro Cemetery. It's been Economy Cemetery. Okay, so what else can cemeteries reveal to us? Like what kind of things can we find on gravestones in El Dorado cemeteries? Well, I noticed that the people who settled here came from all over. We're a nation of immigrants, and El Dorado started and grew as a community of immigrants. A couple of examples are this one from Sam Trace at Sutton Cemetery. It has OKT as the abbreviation for October, which indicated to me, possibly a German-speaking carver. And the Mexican baby markers at Sunset Lawn Cemetery, I've learned, could be a reminder of the large community of railroad workers who came here to help bring the railroad to and through El Dorado. We are all created equal, but we certainly aren't all remembered equally. And cemeteries make that pretty obvious. A couple of examples here are the Fraser Mausoleum. As far as I know, this is the only single family mausoleum in El Dorado. Inside are Sarah Emma Crook and her husband, Nathan Fraser. Nathan came to Butler County in 1868, and he was a partner in El Dorado's first grocery store, and he made his fortune as a businessman and a banker. And you can tell by looking at the large mausoleum and all of the orderly family graves that surround it, that this was a family with money and success. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have this, a little homemade marker with the word baby that's scratched into it. We don't know the baby's name or whose baby it was, but we know that someone cared enough to make sure that this baby was remembered. So both of these families are part of the same community's history, but the physical records they were able to leave behind and the stories they tell are very different. Gravestones can also reveal a lot about the character of an individual. Some epitaphs offer clues about religion, relationships with family, or the kind of person that they were. George Sandefur says, ever sympathizing in the misfortune of others, ever applauding at their success, ready at all times to assist the weak. I thought that was a pretty cool description of someone to be carved in stone. We know he was compassionate and that he, celebrated people instead of being jealous, and he helped people who needed it. We know exactly what qualities his family thought defined him. Chloe Stryker's epitaph tells us something a little different. Her husband Jacob had these words placed on her stone. It says, "Beneath this stone I've placed in trust, not the immortal, but the dust of one on earth to me most dear, who learned in youth for God to fear." Jacob isn't just telling us that, Chloe is religious and has been for her whole life. He's telling us that she was the most important person to him. So these epitaphs can sometimes give us something that like census records or death records or newspapers can't. They can give us a glimpse of how people saw themselves and how the people closest to them wanted them to be remembered. Cemeteries can also reveal mysteries and tragedies. Occasionally you find a cause of death right on a gravestone, or maybe a relationship that isn't immediate family, or an inscription that raises questions. Take this gravestone of little Carr at Sunset Lawns, for example. His stone says, "Baby boy found by Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Rush, October 13th, 1902. Well, I found that in October 1902, someone left a newborn baby on the doorstep of a couple in El Dorado, and they took him in and they named him Carr. But then 3 months later, he had a spasm during the night and he died in their home. Also at Sunset Lawns is this gravestone for an unidentified youth, aged about 17, killed by the Carrs near DeGraff, Kansas, September 19th, 1923. He was found apparently after being hit by a train, and as far as I know, this teenager was never identified. But the community of El Dorado pitched in and gave him burial and a gravestone. So gravestones can tell us a lot about someone. One of my favorite things to look at is the carvings and the symbols on gravestones. Sometimes they can tell us a lot about a person too, maybe more than the words on the gravestone can. These are a couple of books that I reference all the time when I want to know what symbols are. Stories in Stone and Understanding Cemetery Symbols, both are field guides for understanding symbols on stones. The first one, Stories in Stone, fits in your back pocket, so it's kind of nice to have when you're exploring cemeteries. You'll find hands carved on gravestones in just about every cemetery you visit. They're a very common symbol, but what the hand is actually doing has some meaning, and it might help you in your research. The clasped or shaking hands on the first grave for Cyrena Moore, that is supposed to represent an earthly farewell or a heavenly welcome between two married people. And if you look closely, there's usually a difference in the cuffs. One hand is supposed to represent the husband and the other the wife. A finger pointing upward, like the one on Lanta Johnston's grave, usually represents a soul rising to heaven, so might indicate that they were religious. Now this other one with a finger pointing down doesn't mean the opposite of that. A downward pointing hand usually indicates an abrupt death, which is actually probably what happened to Emma based on the reports that I read of her death. Lambs are symbols of innocence and purity, so you most often find them on the graves of young children. The first one for Lowell McKenzie, he died when the tornado came through El Dorado in 1871. And it was written that it ripped him from his mother's arms. And the gravestone in the middle is for two children, Franklin Hinton and an unnamed infant. It has a sleeping lamb on top. But the third one is for Henry Wilkins, who was 66 years old when he died. He was an early settler here in Butler County and a lifelong bachelor, and apparently something of a hermit. And the newspaper said he had no relatives here and very few friends, but he did have one good friend to whom he deeded all of his property to, and that friend paid for his burial and for this gravestone. So while lambs are usually associated with children, you can't always assume that's what they mean just from the symbol alone. Doves are another symbol you see over and over again in cemeteries, and depending on how they're depicted, they can represent peace, innocence, or the Holy Ghost. According to Stories in Stone, they're one of the most common cemetery symbols. But I've never seen a kissing pair like this anywhere. It's on the gravestone of two sisters who died one day apart. It was actually carved by El Dorado Marble Works. And then sometimes that same symbol can look completely different. The one on the gravestone for 2-year-old James Shriver, the dove isn't sitting peacefully or kissing, is actually laying down with a broken wing. So that's pretty sad symbology. These gravestones depicting an angel and a cherub are two of my favorites in El Dorado. I think El Dorado is seriously lacking in like big marble angel statues and big angel monuments. So finding these was kind of exciting. And they're both kind of special because they're what some people call a monument within a monument, which you don't see very often. And they're called that because there is a gravestone carved on the gravestone. That first one for Mary Sproul shows an angel kneeling beside a burial mound, leaving flowers at the base of a gravestone. And the one for Edward Jenkins has a cherub who appears to be holding a scroll and leaning against a monument or a gravestone. I think El Dorado's also seriously lacking in tree stump monuments, which is a little surprising considering the woodman organizations did have lots of members here. A tree stump monument is a gravestone that's carved to look like a chopped tree, symbolizing a life cut short. The woodmen of the world, I believe, provided these tree stump monuments as a death benefit to members' families for a period of time. And this first gravestone here has an image of that chopped tree, that tree stump. And you might also see their motto here beneath it, Dum Tacet Clamat, which means though silent, he speaks, which I think is pretty cool and pretty fitting for a cemetery. And then on the other two, MWA stands for Modern Woodmen of America, which was another organization, and they both have like the axe and the mallet, which are symbols that group used. Masonic imagery is extremely common in cemeteries. You've probably seen these before. It shows up as a square and compass, sometimes with the G in the middle, like the one on Daniel Bronson's gravestone. He was one of El Dorado's founders. In contrast, Levi Kuntz's gravestone has a much more elaborate collection of Masonic symbols that I don't see as often. It's got the blazing sun, the Bible, and then the Masonic trowel beneath it, which is cool. And then the two pillars of King Solomon's temple on either side. So it's a pretty elaborate Masonic tableau. And this was also carved by El Dorado Marble Works. And I had never noticed this logo or even heard of this organization until I was walking around Bella Vista Cemetery one day and I found all of these. This is the logo for the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, later called Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen. But it was a fraternal organization and mutual benefit organization. The letters and the marker are a pretty good giveaway once you know what it is, but the emblem can also have other symbols like those crossed shovels and coal picks. or maybe a shield or a bell or some other symbols. El Dorado had a lot of different gravestone carvers, or at least men who operated marble yards. And I admit I've not done a deep research dive on any of them, at least not enough to speak on any of them. But here's some advertisements that I found of some different marble and granite businesses operating in El Dorado in the 1880s. And here are a couple more advertisements and an example of the El Dorado Marble Works mark at Sutton Cemetery. You can find a lot of older marble gravestones around El Dorado with that El Dorado Marble Works mark on them. A lot of the gravestones here came from nearby places. William B. Caton was a gravestone carver in Winfield. And I know this next mark kind of looks like an L&A, but it's K&A for Kimberly and Adams, who are from Wichita. Christian Kimberly and Charles Adams produced gravestones there with a pretty distinctive style, and I've seen their work here all over El Dorado. Once the railroad reached El Dorado in 1877, gravestones could come from much farther away. I found stones here marked by companies in Fort Scott, Topeka, Burlington, and other places. You can probably even find a few that were ordered from a Sears catalog. And of course, not everybody could afford a professionally carved gravestone shipped in by rail. There are plenty of hand-carved stones around El Dorado too, probably made by someone close to the person who died. Okay, before I get into a couple of my favorite stories, how do we take a gravestone photo or a visit to a cemetery and find the story? Well, these are just a few of the online resources that I use. I use Ancestry, Family Search, and Find a Grave for things like census records, marriage records, death records, family connections. For homestead claims or land records, General Land Office Records is a great place to start. You can at least get one document there and some data. And if I want the complete homestead file, I usually order that through Gopher Records. The man there has an office at NARA headquarters, and he can get me records in about a week. I also get military records through Gopher Records, mostly Civil War, really fast. For historical books, maps, and directories, and other documents, when I can't get to a library, places like Internet Archive and Kansas Memory often have these books available online. Newspapers are probably one of my biggest resources, and I think they're the most fun. I mainly use newspapers.com, but Newspaper Archive and Virginia Chronicle are also good resources if you're tracking people outside of Kansas. Other good resources are genealogy trails, which is maintained by volunteers. And I like Randy Major's Research Hub because if I'm exploring an area, that helps me figure out what township, section, and range I am in, so then I can compare that to an older map. I definitely don't use all of these every time, and I've used a lot of other different resources. It really just depends on where the trail leads. And then, like I already mentioned, most of what I learned about Chelsea came from John D. Milborn's book on Chelsea. The book is about more than Chelsea, and like I said, I consider it to be a vital resource for researching El Dorado cemeteries in general. Other books that I used when researching for the book, and I think that are good when you're diving into research, include Butler County's 80 Years by Jesse Perry Stratford, and of course the History of Butler County by Volney Mooney. Okay, let's get into some of my favorite stories that I uncovered while researching for Buried El Dorado. So, and we'll start with Mary Jane Clark. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with her. But if you look at her gravestone at Bella Vista Cemetery, it's hard to even see her name. It's real tiny on there. And on this gravestone, she shares with her second husband, Edmund, she's just his wife. But Mary was one of El Dorado's first business owners. She sold books, stationery, and toys, and she also served as El Dorado's postmistress from 1870 to 1878. She was born in England, and she came with her family to America in 1852, and she married her first husband, Robert Long, when she was 17. He died 10 years later, and then she moved to El Dorado as Mrs. Long with her father in 1869. And she ran that bookstore for 12 years until she married Edmund Clark in 1882. She was profiled in Butler County's 80 Years by Jesse Perry Stratford as one of the important people in El Dorado's earliest days, but you wouldn't know how important she was to El Dorado's history by looking at her gravestone. You have to look a little harder to find her story. And speaking of Jesse Perry Stratford, I learned that she married one of Mary Jane Clark's grandsons, and this is her gravestone at Belle Vista Cemetery. You guys probably know a lot about her, but Jessie Perry Stratford came to El Dorado around the turn of the century and spent most of her life working as a writer and in newspapers. She started out at the Walnut Valley Times, and over the course of her career, she was connected with the El Dorado Republican, the Wichita Eagle, and the El Dorado Times. She also owned or edited other smaller papers like the Burns News, the Western Butler County Times in Towanda, and the Butler Freelance. Jessie paid attention to people, to women, to their families, their histories, and the little details about people's lives that can disappear over time. And she left a lot of that knowledge behind for us. Butler County's 80 Years, When They Were Very Young, and The Kingdom of Butler are books that a lot of us turn to when researching El Dorado history, and Jessie wrote all of them. Well, she may have co-wrote one of them, she wrote them. And I think her work is impressive because people say she never finished high school. She did receive education, but she never finished high school. So she had a writing career that lasted more than 70 years, and she made sure that the stories of ordinary people in Butler County didn't disappear, which I admire. Okay, now Bertram Sheldon's story is a really sad one, so I apologize in advance for how sad it is, and I might cry. I'm gonna try not to, but forgive me if I do. So I actually wasn't looking for Bertram's story. I found it down a rabbit hole after reading Pioneer Women, Voices from the Kansas Frontier by Joanna Stratton. One of the voices in that book was Mary Lamb Sheldon from El Dorado. Mary, before she married, she was a teacher in Douglas and Rosalia, and then later she helped lead the free library movement that resulted in El Dorado getting the Carnegie Library in 1914. And so while researching Mary, I discovered that KU has the Alva and Mary Sheldon collection, which is a bunch of papers from the estate of Alva and Mary Sheldon. And the collection includes a handwritten journal that they kept from 1879 to 1885. And I'm not trying to gloss over Alva. He was the editor of the Walnut Valley Times for 30 years. He probably personally wrote a lot of the newspaper articles that have helped me in my research. But it was Mary's experience and her words in the journal that affected me. When I found out this journal existed, I was so excited to read this journal, and then it devastated me. Bertram was their first child, and Mary documented just about every milestone, no matter how small. In January 1879, Bertram turned 7 months old. In March, he got his 2 lower front teeth. In May, Bertram stands alone for the first time. We're awful proud of him. A couple of weeks later, our boy Bertram takes his first step, and we are proud of our boy. Later, he had his first haircut, and it made him look like a prize fighter. And he's our pride and joy. And these aren't isolated entries. These go on, page after page. This is definitely not all of them. But everything Bertram does is special. He blows his nose like a man. He fetches water, and it's cute. He helps Alva drive, milk cows, do chores. He's learning to talk, and it's cute. He's a musical prodigy. Again, just a fraction of the entries of how special Bertram was. Even when he scribbled in the journal, he didn't get in trouble. Mary just wrote, "This is Bertram's writing. He holds his pen nicely." She was such a proud mother. But in 1882, the journal was less about Bertram being cute and more about Bertram being sick. On January 21st, Bertram fell down the stairs. Mary wrote that it didn't seem to hurt him much, but it was significant enough to write down. And then within about a week, Mary started to write that Bertram wasn't feeling well. And this continued day after day in February. Bertram don't feel well and wants to come home. Mary was worried and called for the doctor several times. Bertram was sick. By the middle of February, Bertram had a fever. Mary wrote that she felt so anxious and worried over him and that she felt uneasy about him. Soon, Bertram was dangerously sick. Mary documented every agonizing moment of it. Again, not including all of those because I don't want to make this too much of a tearjerker, but Mary documented Bertram's last breath in their journal. She was holding his hand when he died. After Bertram died, the journal almost became a grief journal. The daily entries kind of stopped and they grew farther and farther apart. And eventually Mary wrote, "Our journal looks bare. To say anything of our happenings in which Bertram has no part makes it a sad task." And then in one of the sadder entries near the end of the journal, Mary states, without a question mark, "Why couldn't he have lived?" Mary and Alva and Bertram are all buried together at Belle Vista Cemetery. Okay, I made it. All right, on to something a little lighter. Addie Reed has an interesting story that was originally shared with me on Facebook by Sonia Milbourne. In 1892, Addie Reed purchased a first-class train ticket from El Dorado to North Carolina, which was her home state. Along the way, she was forced to move to a car reserved for Black people because she was Black, and North Carolina required her to do so, even though she had purchased a first-class ticket. I guess things are a little different there. Addie sued the railroad after this for $1,500, and she won, but she was only awarded $97, which doesn't sound like very much, but I think that would have been like $3,500 in 1892, so not really a small chunk of change. I wish I knew more to tell you about Addie, but this was about all I could find about her. Frances Markham also seems like a really interesting character to me, but not one that necessarily gets mentioned in El Dorado's history, at least not that I could find. And he's one I wish I could tell you more about. What I did find out is that he patented a turpentine-based medicine called Dr. Markham's Australian Oil that treated rattlesnake bites, sprains, cuts, pains, burns, and the like. And he traveled all around the Midwest trying to sell this Australian oil. And he wasn't from Australia, so. And then I found in 1884, newspapers in Leavenworth and Rossville and St. Mary's began reporting that Dr. Markham drowned, traveling the country, selling his patented oil. They even had an inquest after the body was recovered and determined that, yes, Dr. Markham had definitely accidentally drowned, but it wasn't Dr. Markham. He didn't die until 1902. So I wish I could find more about this drowning or what Dr. Markham thought about his reported death, but I couldn't find anything other than this information here, that he actually died in 1902, and that's what his gravestone says. So just a good reminder, I guess, that not everything you read is true. Okay, we'll talk about Milton Bradley. Not that Milton Bradley. This Milton Bradley was one of El Dorado's early settlers, and he was pretty prominent locally. He was elected Butler County Treasurer twice. He served as a Justice of the Peace, and he was a chairman of the county commissioners. People described Milton as quiet, honorable, very intelligent, and extremely frugal. But something went wrong with Milton. In April 1890, Milton told his family and friends that he was going on a hunting and fishing trip, which wasn't unusual. He did that often. He left El Dorado with his horse and buggy, his dog, his fishing gear, and some camping supplies. And everyone thought maybe most of his money, because he left his wife Sarah with about $20. And then he just didn't come back. He disappeared. And as the weeks turned into months and then eventually years, some crazy rumors started circulating. Some people assumed that since he left his wife with very little money, he must have taken all of his money with him. And so this made him a target for horse thieves. So horse thieves must have killed him for his money. But it seems like Milton may not have had any money. He may have been having financial troubles that led him to leaving his life and family behind. I couldn't quite confirm this, but it seems like that might be. And then came some national news reports. People said that Milton had been spotted in Arkansas and that he was bearded and dirty and naked and supposedly running wild through the woods. But that wasn't true either. Milton had actually spent months wandering through Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Missouri. And we know this because he kept a diary of the entire trip, recording his movements almost every day. And he wrote one-liners like 6 miles southwest of Olivia, Minnesota, or at Harrington, Nebraska, hard rain. Eventually, Milton came back, but he settled near a community called Lanesville, which is about 120 miles from El Dorado. And he started calling himself Milton Blakesley, which was his mother's maiden name. People in Lanesville said that Milton kept mostly to himself, but he worked for local farmers, and that he was welcome to stay in people's homes, but that he preferred to sleep on a pile of hay in the barn. So meanwhile, back in El Dorado, his family and friends were looking for him for almost 3 years. And then in 1893, Milton got sick. And in that diary he kept, he left instructions that said if anything happened to him, someone should contact his wife in El Dorado. So that's how they learned what happened to him and where he had been, because he kept that diary and he died, and someone found it and followed the instruction. Okay, let's chat about William Sluss for a moment. William Sluss came to Butler County in 1870 and watched the area develop. One account put it as from a primitive prairie into one of the greatest in the state. Jesse Perry Stratford wrote that, quote, "Thrill of pioneering elated him, even when he was trapped in a sinkhole while exploring a natural cave on his claim, and his life was saved by a hairbreadth by the only other settler within miles." He turned a one-room shack into a two-story stone house for his wife and family, and I learned that house is still standing today and has been or is being restored. He was already a successful farmer and cattleman long before oil entered the picture. Over the year, he had thousands of cattle and expanded his farm to about 1,800 acres in Butler County. Now, Stapleton #1 was the first oil strike in El Dorado, but not long after came the discovery of the oil pools on the Sluss property, and that greatly increased his wealth. In 1929, he was reportedly earning 4 figures a month from the oil. But even then, he apparently still delighted in working 12-hour days on the farm. But by that time, he had a tractor, automatic waterers, electricity in his multiple barns that were designed specifically for the animals they housed. Just about every modern farming technology the world had to offer at that time, it seemed like he invested in. So by the end of his life, Jesse Perry Stratford and others were calling him the grand old pioneer of Butler County. Jesse also wrote that, quote, "Oil does not matter, wealth does not matter, but land, purebred stock, smooth bluegrass lawns, the purple iris against snowy spirea, sunshine and rain, and a wide expanse of acres about their homes. These create joy in the hearts of the Sluss families." Reuben Waller is one of those people whose story became a little more complicated the more I researched him. Reuben was born enslaved in the South, and when he died in El Dorado in 1945, he was widely celebrated as having lived to age 105. And it was reported and repeated still today that his age is a matter of record, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But after slavery ended, Reuben joined the 10th U.S. Cavalry, one of the black regiments whose soldiers became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. He served 5 years on the Western frontier, and one of the most notable things his company took part in was the rescue of Forsyth's scouts after the Battle of Beecher Island. Reuben later wrote extensively about his years as a soldier, including a nearly 30,000-word account called 5 Years a Soldier on the Plains that was published over multiple weeks in the Towanda Herald. Reuben said he had a photographic memory, and as a child, he was tasked with remembering things for his enslaver. Because of this, he says he got to travel a little bit. He told stories about making whiskey for Confederate troops, about accompanying his enslaver through the Civil War, and he tells a really dramatic, almost cinematic tale of watching Lee surrender to Grant, which definitely didn't happen the way Reuben described it. And I wasn't able to verify his Civil War service, and a lot of the details in his story don't match the historic record. But the parts of his military history that we can document are pretty remarkable on their own. And his written accounts of some of the battles on the plains are the only record we have. The stories Reuben tells are fantastic. After his military service ended, Reuben came to Butler County and claimed 160 acres northwest of El Dorado. By 1880, just like everyone else, he built a house, a stable, he had a hen house, a corn crib. Reuben has had 700 fruit trees and half a mile of hedge. And then he eventually left that homestead and moved into town where he lived for more than 70 years. And when he died in 1945, people here remembered him as an honest and respected neighbor and friend, and he was celebrated as being a centenarian, or someone who reached at least 100 years old. Now, near the end of his life, Reuben was telling reporters that he was born in 1840 and that he had reached the age of 100. And when I was searching for documents proving Reuben's age, I discovered that it was Victor Murdoch of the Wichita Eagle who first wrote that Reuben's age was a matter of record. But that was because Reuben said it was. But when Reuben testified for his own homestead claim in 1880, he said he was 30 years old. That would make him born in 1850. Federal census records from 1880, 1900, 1910, 1920 all record Reuben's age that matches a birth year of about 1850. The earliest record that I could find that records an age that corresponds with the birth date of 1840 was in the 1930 census, which was right around the time that I also found evidence of Reuben publicly claiming to be 10 years older than records indicate. So I think he was probably about 95 when he died rather than 105, but it doesn't really matter. Like, I think Reuben's story is a good example, though, of something I learned when doing research. Just because something was told in the paper or even said by the person themselves doesn't necessarily mean every part of it's true. Sometimes figuring out the truth is part of the story. And the last story I'm going to talk about today is Clara. I don't know if any of you like ghost stories, but I'm not going to tell one. I'm going to try to debunk one, though. Clara Wiley Castle is probably one of the better known names at Bella Vista Cemetery, although a lot of people know her because of her gruesome murder and the ghost stories surrounding her grave, rather than because of who she actually was. Clara was born in Ohio. She was the oldest of 7, and she came to Kansas with her family as a teenager. Her parents raised her in the Methodist Church, and she was active in church social clubs. She was also, I guess, what one might call a socialite. She was involved in several clubs and organizations in El Dorado, and her comings and goings were reported. She finished her schooling in El Dorado, and she graduated with a music degree from the El Dorado College Conservatory. Clara was a very talented singer. The Walnut Valley Times regularly mentioned her reporting at events around town and how she had a lovely voice. Alva Sheldon of the Walnut Valley Times took a particular liking to Clara's voice. He mentions there in that second article that the Times is very partial to Miss Wiley's singing. And it seems like the people of El Dorado felt the same way about her singing ability. One solo was such a hit that the audience insisted on an encore, which I guess was technically forbidden at that event. But as Alva says here, the audience made the rule and called her back to the stage. Clara was also said to be especially and particularly well schooled, and she was obviously very beautiful. Clara's murderer was a woman named Jessie Morrison. Jessie was born in West Virginia. She was the 6th of 9 children, and her mother died when she was just 9 years old. Jessie also came to Kansas as a teenager, and like Clara, Jessie was a member of the Methodist Church. Both women socialized in the same church clubs for young people, even though Jessie was about 8 years older than Clara. Jessie did play the organ occasionally at church, but she doesn't appear to have been musically trained like Clara, and she didn't have a voice like Clara's either. Jessie wasn't especially well schooled like Clara. Most census records that I found state that she did not attend school. And while beauty's in the eye of the beholder, at least one reporter wrote shortly after the murders that Jessie was, quote, not pretty. One particularly brutal reporter wrote that, quote, 31 years have passed over her, and in passing, they have left their impress. She has reached the time of life when it ceases to be a joke to be called an old maid. Already suggestions of wrinkles have come to warn her that youth is passing from her. They were really brutal back then. Jessie worked at a local department store with Olin, Clara's fiance. And Jessie was fired from that job, partially due to obsessive and stalkerish behavior towards Olin. Like Clara, Olin was born in Ohio, and he was his parents' first child. And also, like Clara, Olin was a member of the Methodist Church, and he was musically trained. He was in El Dorado's Sunflower Band, so obviously a super cool dude. He also played in the El Dorado Orchestra, and he even left El Dorado to play in the Cleveland Orchestra for a little bit. Before the murder, Olin was made to seem like a popular and desirable ladies' man. He dated around and apparently even took Jessie on a few buggy rides. But after the murder, at least one newspaper published that he was, quote, not a particularly bright-looking chap, and that his appearance is negative, which I assume means ordinary or maybe bad-looking, I don't know. They also said that he was, quote, not a fellow that any woman would be expected to rave over, and it is almost inconceivable that Jessie Morrison should commit murder on his account. Rude. But the women did bicker and fight over Olin in the months and weeks leading up to the marriage. But in June of 1900, Clara and Olin, two of El Dorado's most popular young people, were married. The paper reported that the charming, accomplished, and popular young lady began housekeeping immediately at their home on Merchant Street. They lived at 107 Merchant Street, and I believe Merchant is now Washington, so I think the home would have been on the corner of Washington and Central, where the First Presbyterian Church is today. It was 9 days after the wedding that Jessie showed up at their home while Olin was at work. Jessie attacked Clara with a razor, and she sliced her 18 times, including across her neck, severing her trachea and leaving her unable to speak or sing. Somehow, Clara survived for 18 days after this attack. Can you imagine? But because she couldn't speak, Clara wrote out her version of what happened during, and that was used later during Jessie's murder trial. Clara also wrote that she forgave Jessie. She forgave her for what she did. Now, could someone with a forgiving heart be a haunting ghost? I don't think so. But anyway, Clara died on July 10th, 1900, but by then her story had made national news. Jessie ended up being tried 3 times for this murder. Her first trial ended in a hung jury, and she appealed her second conviction and won. The Jessie Morrison trial was reported across the country, usually on the front page, often taking up half the page or more. The Walnut Valley Times used the entire front page multiple times to report on all the different proceedings. This case was called the most tragic and sensational women's quarrel in the history of Kansas. And one reporter said it put El Dorado on the map as the home of Jessie Morrison, the famous woman convict. Jessie's trials divided El Dorado so badly that the newspaper reported friendships ending, church groups splitting up, and even neighbors refusing to share milk with each other because they disagreed about whether or not Jessie was guilty. At her third trial, Jessie was found guilty for a second time, and this time she was sentenced to be executed. But her execution was stayed, and she was given 25 years in prison. She served only about 8 years of that sentence before being paroled for good behavior. And then a few years later, she was granted an unconditional pardon. So I guess it makes sense why folks turned Clara into a ghost story. The community was turned upside down and justice wasn't really served. Jessie got to live out the rest of her life as a free woman. Some think basically unpunished for what she did. So I can see how some people believe that this upset Clara in the afterlife. People say Clara haunts Bella Vista Cemetery, and that if you try to photograph her grave, you won't be able to. Your camera will malfunction. But I've obviously photographed it plenty of times. My camera works just fine. So maybe that means she's just not mad at me. I don't know. But stories like Clara's are one reason why I started doing this. You can walk through a cemetery, you can see a name on a stone, you can read an interesting epitaph or hear a ghost story or a tragic tale and just leave it at that. Or you can start asking questions. And once you do, you might find that the real person and the real story is a little more interesting than the legend. And that's all I've got. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming to our speaker series this month. Next month, I don't actually remember who we have, but there will be someone interesting here next month. Remember that you can pre-order your sandwiches the Wednesday before our series, and they will be here for you on Thursday. Speaking of Jesse Perry, we have kicked off our Jesse Perry Stratford Writing Contest. The deadline is December 18th at 11:59 p.m. We have expanded that contest. So that contest has been around for, I believe, around 40, I just did the math last week, 47 years, somewhere around there. It's been around for a while. And we recently expanded it this year to include more schools, more genres, more age groups. So you can find all that information online and what writing contest you're able to enter. Have a great day, everyone, and I will see y'all next month.